Overview, Pastoral Peoples on the Global Stage, the Mongol Moment, 1200 to 1500. Here's the main idea. Beginning in the 13th century, the Mongols established a variety of Eurasian empires by conquest, with significant and widespread consequences. Relevance. History is full of crossroads from which a parallel future could have diverged. The Mongol empires is one such moment in history. They impacted so many civilizations that would rule much of the world in future centuries: China, Europe, and Islamic empires. We study the Mongols today for insight into how our modern world was made, and as a reminder for the significant two-way interactions humans have with the environment. Setting the stage. Back in Chapter 2, you learned about the development of agricultural societies and the beginnings of civilization. You also learned about the parallel development of pastoral or nomadic societies, such as the Egyptian society. Throughout the classical era and beyond, pastoralists developed increasingly sophisticated societies based on animals rather than plants. Also, don't forget about the importance of military power in establishing and maintaining empires. Nomads who herded horses were often extremely powerful militarily, and that will be especially significant in this chapter when you learn about the Mongols. And this picture here is showing a Mongol horseman. And notice their use here of the bow and arrow, which we'll be talking about in the future. So the first heading is called The Long History of Pastoral Nomads. Pastoral societies in Afro-Eurasia developed unique adaptations to environmental conditions, creating societies with significant interactions with agricultural neighbors. The world of pastoral societies. This heading covers basic features pastoral societies have in common. In this section, you'll review pastoral societies, look at some key ones throughout history, and then in the next section, we'll start with the Mongols. So, the basic features of pastoral societies include a smaller size than agricultural, less patriarchy, frequent movement, a tendency to have smaller states, strong military, and the development of technology such as horse saddles and the compound bow. Most importantly, they interacted frequently with agricultural neighbors. Don't forget that pastoralists needed ready access to agricultural products, and that agriculturalists needed access to animal products. So throughout world history, there's been a close relationship between these neighboring communities with significant and sometimes catastrophic results. Next, the book reviews some important pastoral societies, starting with the Xiongnu, which was covered in chapters 4 and 9. You remember them to the north of China during the time of the Han Dynasty. This pastoral society mastered the horse and the bow and created an innovation in uniting under the rule of a single leader in the 3rd century BCE. That's the Xiongnu Confederacy, shown up here to the north of China. This forced the Han Dynasty to recognize the Xiongnu Confederation as an independent state. Many centuries later, the Mongols would come from the same area and change history. So the region to the north of the traditional boundaries of China is sometimes known as Mongolia, and that's the homeland of the Mongols. Arabs and Turks. We sometimes forget that the Arab culture that gave birth to Islam began as a nomadic civilization, which you may remember from the last chapter. The Arabs domesticated the camel, using it for both subsistence and for military conquest. Eventually, most Arab civilization was more urban than nomadic. The Turks moved out of their homeland in Central Asia. Shown in dark blue here is the Central Asia, although the distant descendants of the Turks were from the same area as the Mongols up here north of China. When the Turks moved out of their homeland, they interacted with the major empires of the area: China, Persia, and Byzantium. Turkic culture influenced these civilizations. The conversion of Turks to Islam helped to spread the religion throughout Eurasia and into the eastern borders of Europe, and eventually in the creation of the Ottoman Empire. More on them in a future chapter. Finally, the Masai of East Africa. The Masai are nomads who primarily rely on cattle for sustenance and continue to do so to this day. And they're shown in red here on the map. This is Eastern Africa. And here's the Indian Ocean, and the Middle East would be up here off the map. As you read, look for examples of the complexity of relationships between pastoral and agricultural societies, especially in their attitudes towards each other. Breakout, the Mongol Empire. So here we are with the Mongols. Chinggis Khan is also known as Genghis Khan. Our book uses a more modern spelling of Genghis Khan, so it's the same guy. He united the Mongols and conquered much of Eurasia, creating the largest land empire in world history. From Temujin to Chinggis Khan. Before Chinggis Khan, the Mongols were a loose assortment of clans with no inclination to unite. A man named Temujin united his clan, and through a series of victories was eventually recognized as supreme leader of the great Mongol nation, at that point taking the title Chinggis Khan. Chinggis needed a project for his army once he'd assumed control of the Mongol nation, so he focused on expansion. The next 50 years demonstrated the astonishing military superiority of the Mongols as they had a series of victories that created an empire. Explaining the Mongol moment. Your book compares the Mongol Empire to Rome in that its creation was not part of a grand plan, just momentum as it expanded. The chief reason for its success was a superior military. For instance, one historian notes that at the time of the conquest of Europe in the 13th century, European battle tactics would have been familiar to Romans from 1,000 years before, but Mongol tactics would have been familiar to a soldier fighting in World War II 700 years later. This section reviews that military strategy and also the ruthlessness of the Mongols. Most enemies were absolutely terrified of them. However, Mongols could be rather tolerant to people who accepted conquest in terms of religion, and also their policies were very friendly towards merchants. And finally, the Mongols were extremely effective at constructing communication systems to help manage an empire. So look in this section for general methods of how the Mongols conquered people, and also in general, their methods of rule. And the book will go on in the next heading to look at 3 cases in more specific detail. Mongol rule in China, Persia, and Russia had significant similarities and differences. First, China. The Mongols conquered the Sung dynasty by 1279 and established rule there, unifying China for the first time in centuries, calling the new dynasty the Yuan dynasty. So you might remember that during the Song dynasty, China was unified down here in the southern part of the area, but the north was ruled by a loose confederation of states from the descendants of the Xiongnu. So the Mongols came, and in yellow here we have what's called the Great Khanate, which is the Yuan dynasty, and it kind of unified all of China for the first time in centuries. And in many cases that was seen as a positive. Ever practical, the Mongols adopted many Chinese administrative techniques, but maintained their own culture. Kublai Khan was the most famous Mongol emperor. He's the one who received Marco Polo, which is what's shown in this painting here. Look for contrasts in his policies as you read. On the one hand, he was a benevolent ruler who made many improvements for the public good, and on the other, he was a harsh ruler who kept the Chinese in a subservient position. An example of the Mongol attitude towards the Chinese is that when they conquered China, there's a description in the book that a ruler couldn't decide what to do with all this land they conquered, and apparently he seriously considered killing all of the humans so that they could have more grazing land for their horses. That was not decided upon, but it gives you a sense of the ruthlessness that the Mongols could exhibit towards their defeated foes. So Mongol rule in China lasted for about 100 years. Next, Persia and the Mongols. On this map, the Persian Empire is shown in green here, and it takes the title of Il Khanate, Il meaning subordinate. After the death of Chinggis Khan, this giant empire he created, which is loosely shown in all the colors here on the map, there's a little bit of expansion after his death, was divided up among his grandsons. And you start to get the splintering of the Mongol Empire into these 4 main sections here. So back to Persia. The conquest of Islamic Persia in the mid-13th century was even more devastating than that of China. For instance, during the sacking of Baghdad, which was the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, approximately 200,000 people were killed. There was also much damage to their agriculture and economy in Persia. A significant difference between rule in Persia and China was that the Mongols themselves adapted more to local customs in Persia. So look for examples of this as you're reading. For instance, the conversion to Islam, the Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam, and the Mongols followed him in that. And they also maintained much of the Persian bureaucracy when they took over Persia. They were very practical people, and in many cases, they used whatever was working and adapted their own culture to it, and that's especially true in Persia. And an example of how much they adapted to Persian customs is that when the Mongol rule of Persia ended, Mongols generally were absorbed into Persian society rather than being driven out as they were from China. And then finally, Russia. Think back to chapter 10. Russia was a fairly new state when the Mongols attacked beginning in 1237. Shown in this brown color up here. According to Russian accounts, this was the most violent Mongol conquest. Russians referred to the Mongols as the Golden Horde. A significant difference is that the Mongols did not settle in Russia but ruled it from afar, maintaining traditional Mongol ways of life and ruling through subordinate Russian princes. And this was because there was so little infrastructure in Russia that it wasn't worth the Mongols' trouble to rule every city and to kind of urbanize. So there's a description of how they tended to live outside of cities in their traditional Mongol manner of living in tents, and they took conquered Russian princes and had them rule in their place. The developing Russian state actually benefited in the long run from Mongol conquest. Mongol rule helped to solidify Moscow as the capital, and it allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to flourish. When the Mongols were driven out by the end of the 14th century, Mongol rule was over. Short-lived, but incredibly significant. The last section is called the Mongol Empire as a Eurasian network. The Mongol Empire brought Christian, Islamic, and Buddhist cultures into closer contact than ever with significant consequences. This section reviews the massive importance in world history of the Mongols. So pay a special attention here to effects of Mongol rule, starting with toward a world economy. A desire for tax revenue caused the Mongols to actively encourage trade. This map shows trade circuits in the around 1300, which is the kind of the peak of the Mongol conquest. The result was to bring diverse cultures into closer contact, especially Europe, which due to Mongol influence became aware of long-established trade patterns. And as mentioned earlier, this fascination with the East would eventually lead to the voyages of Columbus. So pay attention to these circuits of world trade because their intersection is increasingly significant. Here is the Silk Roads network. There is an East Asian network down here. This network here and this network here sort of combine to be the Indian Ocean network. And there we have a Mediterranean network right here, but I want you to pay attention to the isolation of Europe. There is a West European trade network, sort of in Northwest Europe, and there is this trade network over here in Western Europe, but they're relatively isolated. And that's going to be important from an effects perspective of Mongol rule because it helps bring Europe into these global trade networks. Diplomacy on a Eurasian scale. This section begins with one of the great what-ifs of world history. Look for the significance of the death of the great Khan Ogadai, who is Chinggis Khan's son, and what happened when he died in terms of the conquest of Europe right around here on this border. There is no reason to expect that the Mongols would not have conquered all of Europe if Ogadai had not died when he did. The significance of the rest of the section is in helping civilizations gain a greater understanding of each other, such as Europe with much of Eurasia and Persia with China. Cultural exchange in the Mongol realm. This section reviews culture and technology transferred by the networks of exchange created by the Mongols. For instance, Chinese gunpowder technology moved west during this time. Europe benefited the most from this exchange because it had been cut off from the rest of the world since the fall of Rome. So again, this is where we look at these European trade networks and how isolated they are. And some degree of consistency of rule across Eurasia is going to help draw Europe, especially in the Mediterranean, and also in this intersection in Western Europe, into the trade networks over here. Despite the terrible consequences reviewed in the next section, one could argue that the Mongol moment was a positive thing in the long run for Europe. So look for reasons that would support that argument. The plague. One common feature in history between nomads and agriculturists is exposure to disease. Nomads often have an immunity due to their close proximity to animals that agriculturists do not. The plague, or Black Death, was the most devastating example of this in history. Historians estimate that 50% of Europe's population died between 1348 and 1350. The spread of this disease was due to the same networks of exchange that had such benefit culturally and economically at this time. So on the map here, notice in red, this is where historians believe the plague initiated. And it moves in a couple directions here, but once it comes down here, for instance, to the southwest, to the coast of India, it is now exposed in this Indian Ocean trade network. And so we believe it was carried by rats, who would be in the cargo holds of these ships and spread it around the world. And this tendency of trade networks to spread disease and create a pandemic is relevant to us today. After reviewing the devastation caused by the spread of the plague, this section ends by describing ways that Europe actually benefited from the process. For instance, it helped to weaken Mongol control over Eurasia, and it paved the way for the Europeans to enter and eventually control much of the Asian trade networks by the 16th century. Now the 10-second spice review. Pastoral societies, including the Mongols, were less patriarchal than agriculturalists. Mongol Khanates used a variety of strategies in ruling Eurasia, and their environmental knowledge led to the growth of trade networks that resulted in the transfer of epidemic diseases. These trade networks facilitated the movement of languages and an exchange of technology, and commerce expanded as a result. Here's a visual summary. The chapter is organized as a review of pastoralists. Remember, we had the Xiongnu up in East Asia, the Arabs and the Turks in Central Asia and the Middle East, the Mongols, of course, starting from East Asia and moving into Central Asia, and then the Masai in East Africa. And the book, of course, focuses on the Mongols, which is undoubtedly the most significant of these groups. So we have the creation of the Mongol Empire under Chinggis Khan, and the rest of the book deals with its effects on Eurasia. You can look at that regionally as the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanates of Persia, and then the Kipchak Khanate in Russia. And don't forget about that last section that looks at more general effects on Eurasia in the area of trade, technology, and disease. That's your Chapter 12 overview. Happy reading.
I am the world's forgotten boy, the one whose search is ended.